Okay, believe it or not, in that small amount of time, we had a little food, changed out of some hot clothes. Let's do this. So let's pick up from where we left off. We'll have to make slideshows for all that. Those are interesting points. Let's say share screen, dialogue, to stage, boom. And let's see, turn that off. Then I think what we'll do is let's bring it over here. Okay. So, part two, let's continue with C.S. Lewis's The Discarded Image. That's even better. Chapter 3. Selected Materials, the Classical Period. O vana gloria de lumine posse, con poco verde in su la cima dura. Before turning to the model itself, it will be well to give an account of some, at least, among the sources from which it was derived. To deal with all would be far beyond the scope of this book, and would lead me into regions where better guides can easily be found. Thus, there are perhaps no sources so necessary for a student on medieval literature to know as the Bible, Virgil, and Ovid. But I shall say nothing about any of the three. Many of my readers know them already. Those who do not are at least aware that they need to. Again, although I shall have much to say about the old astronomy, I shall not describe Ptolemy's Almagest. The text with a French translation is available, and many histories of science exist. Casual statements about pre-Copernican astronomy in modern scientists who are not historians are often unreliable. I shall concentrate on those sources which are least easily accessible or least generally known to educated people, or which best illustrate the curious process whereby the model assimilated them. Those which seem to me most important belong to the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries AD, and these will form the subject of the next chapter. In the meantime, I turn to certain earlier works which the classical tradition in our schools has tended to keep in the background. The Somnium Scipionis, Plato's Republic, as everyone knows, ends with an account of the afterlife, put into the mouth of one the Armenian, who had returned from the dead. When Cicero, somewhere about 50 BC, wrote his own Republic, not to be outdone, he ended with a similar vision. Scipio Africanus Minor, one of the speakers in Cicero's dialogue, relates in the 6th and last book a remarkable dream. Most of Cicero's Republic has reached us in a fragmentary condition for a reason which will appear later. This part, the Somnium Scipionis, has come down intact. Okay, so we remember what we're doing here, and now we're going to start doing it, and we know why. We forgot to take the simultaneous sip. Dopamine hit of the day, thing that makes everything better, and it happens right now. Go. Scipio begins by telling us that during the evening which preceded his dream, he had been talking about his adoptive grandfather, Scipio Africanus Major. That, he says, is doubtless why he appeared to me in my dream, for our dreams are commonly begotten by our recent waking thoughts. This little attempt to give plausibility to a fictitious dream by offering psychological causes is imitated in the dream poetry of the Middle Ages. Thus, Chaucer, in the proem to the book of the Duchess, reads the lovers parted by death before he dreams of them. In the Parliament, he reads the the Somnium Scipionis itself, and suggests that this may be why he dreamed of Scipio. Africanus Major carries Africanus Minor up to a height whence he looks down on Carthage, quote, from an exalted place, bright and shining, filled with stars. They are, in fact, in the highest celestial sphere, the stellatum. This is the prototype of many ascents to heaven in later literature, those of Dante, of Chaucer, of Troilus' ghost, of the lover in the king's choir. Don Quixote and Sancho were once persuaded that they were making just such an ascent. Okay, so there's some realm that's being referenced that they got to, full of stars. After foretelling his grandfather's future political career, and from which you can look down at the happenings on earth, grandson's future political career, just as Cacciaguida foretells Dante's in Paradiso, Africanus explains to him that, quote, all who have been saviors or champions of their native land or increased its dominions have their appointed place in heaven. This is a good instance of the intractable material with which later syncretism was confronted. Cicero is making a heaven for public men, for politicians and generals. Neither the pagan sage, like Pythagoras, nor the Christian saint could enter it. This was quite inconsistent with some pagan and with all Christian authorities. But in this case, as we shall see later, a harmonistic interpretation had before the Middle Ages began. The younger Scipio, fired by this prospect, now asks why he should not hasten to join that happy company at once. No, replies the elder, unless that God who has for his temple this whole universe which you behold has set you free from the fetters of the body. The way hither is not open to you. So you can't get there unless you're dead. For men were born under the law that they should garrison the globe. You see yonder in the middle of the temple, which is called earth. Therefore, you, Publius, and all good men must retain the soul in the body's fetters and not depart from human life without the orders of him who gave you a soul. Otherwise, you may be held to have deserted the duty allotted by God to man. This prohibition of suicide is Platonic. I think Cicero is following a passage in Plato's Phaedo where Socrates remarks of suicide. They say it is unlawful, even one of those few acts which are unlawful in all circumstances. He goes on to explain whether we accept or not the doctrine taught in the mysteries that the body is a prison and we must not break from it. At any rate, we men are certainly the property of the gods, and property must not dispose of itself. Great citations from Plato. That this prohibition makes part of Christian ethics is indisputable. But many, not unlearned people, have been unable to tell me when or how it became so. The passage we are considering may possibly have had some influence. Certainly, references in later writers to suicide or to the unlawful risking of one's own life seem to be written with the speech of Africanus in mind, for they draw out the military metaphor which is implicit in it. Spencer's Red Cross Knight answers despair's temptation to suicide with the words, the soldier may not move from the watchful stead, nor leave his stand until his captain bed. And despair, trying to turn the argument, replies, he that points the sentinel his room doth license him depart at sound of morning droom. Similarly, Dawn, reprobate, dueling, Dawn reprobates dueling in the words, O desperate coward, wilt thou seem bold, and to thy foes and his, who made thee to stand sentinel in his world's garrison, thus yields. Scipio now noticed that the stars were globes, which easily outstripped the earth in size. Indeed, the earth now appeared so small in comparison that the Roman Empire, which was hardly more than a point on that tiny surface, excited his contempt. This passage was constantly in the minds of succeeding writers. The insignificance by cosmic standards of the earth became as much a commonplace to the medieval as to the modern thinker. It was part of the moralist stock in trade, used as Cicero uses it, to mortify human ambition. Other details from the Sumnium will meet us in later literature, though it was certainly not the only channel by which all of them were transmitted. So this is interesting. This question that he's asking of how did these medievals who cared about the writings of so many different sources harmonize them and put them together? And he says, I've asked scholars, why is it anti-Christian to commit suicide? But is there anything in the Bible that says you can't kill yourself? And it seems he's saying that maybe this came from Cicero, came from Plato, that there's this idea that there's a law that has granted to you a soul that you might do certain things on earth and that you have no right to send that soul back until it bids you to come. Other details from the Sumnium will meet us in later literature, though it's certainly not the only channel by which all of them were transmitted. In 18, we have the music of the spheres. In 26, the doctrine of the earthbound ghost. In 17, if it will not be thought too trifling, we may notice that the sun is the world's mind, mens mundi. Ovid made it mundi oculus, the world's eye. The elder Pliny referred reverted to Cicero with a slight change, mundi animus, the world's animator. There's a scientific idea relevant to superficial life, which we are some. Bernardus Sylvestris used both honorifics, mens mundi and mundinasque oculus. Milton, who had presumably not read Bernardus, but had certainly read the Somnium, and Ovid, and probably Pliny, does the same. Thou son of this great world, both eye and soul, says he. Shelley, perhaps with Milton only in mind, raises the eye image to a higher level, the eye with which the universe beholds itself and knows itself divine. Hymn of Apollo 31. Far more important than such curiosities, however, is the general character of this text, which is typical of much material which the Middle Ages inherited from antiquity. Superficially, it seems to need only a few touches to bring it into line with Christianity. Fundamentally, it presupposes a wholly pagan ethics and metaphysics. As we have seen, there is a heaven, but a heaven for statesmen. Scipio is exhorted to look above and despise the world, but he is to despise primarily, quote, the talk of the rabble. And what he is to look for above is the reward of his achievements. Okay, so noticing a very pagan ethic. It will be dicus, fame, or glory in a sense very different from the Christian. Most deceptive of all is 24, where he is exhorted to remember that not he, but only his body is mortal. I'm not sure how different it is, actually. Every Christian would, in some sense, agree, but it is followed almost immediately by the words, realize, therefore, that you are a god. For Cicero, that is obvious among the Greeks, says von Hugel. And he might have said, in all classical thought, he who says immortal says God. The conceptions are interchangeable. If men can go to heaven, it is because they came from there. Their ascent is a return. That is why the body is fetters. We come into it. It is irrelevant to our nature. The mind of each man is the man. All this belongs to a circle of ideas wholly different from from the Christian doctrines of man's creation, fall, redemption, and resurrection. The attitude to the body which it involves was to be an unfortunate legacy for medieval Christendom. Remember how important the bodily resurrection is to Christianity, or supposed to be. Perhaps it suffered some from this harmonization. Cicero also hands on a doctrine which may have helped for centuries to discourage geographical exploration. The Earth is, of course, spherical. It is divided into five zones, of which two, the Arctic and the Antarctic, are uninhabitable through cold. Between the two habitable and temperate zones spreads the torrid zone, uninhabitable through heat. This is why the antipodes, the contrariwise footed people who plant their footsteps in the direction opposite to you, right? You know, all the memes of Australians and everything is upside down, where they just flip something upside down and say, this is what it's like in Australia. So, one of the medieval conceptions of the earth was that it was divided into five zones, and three of them were uninhabitable. And one uninhabitable zone was around the equator. Okay. So, basically, when explorers started traveling and circumnavigating the globe, it would have been to the minds of the people in those cultures as if they had taken a spaceship to Mars. The life that existed in that other zone was expected to be alien life. And of course, it was. Horses and potatoes and different diseases and all sorts of things got moved around the earth when we started moving around the entire earth after this age. In fact, one of the explanations for all of the extinction events that have happened, where we say, "Oh no, where are all the life is all the life going?" is that we're actually just returning to a Pangea type life, um, not cycle, but type of life, where the life that exists has one apex predator instead of 12 different ones in different zones where they never interact with each other. It has one type of creature that's fitting this one niche rather than a bunch fitting that same type of niche in different environments. But when the explorers would come back and they would write their books, I mean, this is why uh, Jonathan Swift can write Gulliver's Travels and a priest can read it and say, I don't even believe this is true. It's because other people, he was writing a satire of the type of book that other people were writing, saying, I've traveled around the world and these are the strange things that I found. And people, it was alien life. It was life that did evolve in a different place that we thought we could never reach. This is all right. So adversa vobis adversa vobis urgent vestigia. Their feet are planted in the opposite direction as you, and live in the southern temperate zone are nothing to us. We can never meet them. A belt of deadly heat is between us and them. It was against this theory that George Best wrote his chapter Experiences and Reasons of the Sphere to prove all parts of the world habitable and thereby to confute the position of the five zones. Like all his successors, Cicero makes the moon the boundary between eternal and perishable things. So remember, he's looking at classical sources that had written artifacts that had to be incorporated by the medieval project of harmonizing all these varied writings. And so he's saying, well, there's the realm of the eternal that never dies. There's the realm of the temporal here. Our bodies are made up of the temporal that dies here, but our souls come from the eternal, and to the eternal they will return one day. But you're not allowed to set your soul free until you die. You can't, all of that stuff. He's showing the model that they're using of the cosmic realms. And they're using the moon as the boundary between the two. And also asserts the influence of the planets on our fortunes, rather vaguely and, and incompletely, but also without the qualifications which a medieval theologian would have added. Lucan lived from AD 34 to 65. Seneca and Gallio, the one who cared for none of these things, were his uncles. His epic on the Civil War, the Pharsalia, was cut short by the wretchedest death a man can die. He conspired against Nero, was caught, turned king's evidence under a promise of pardon, incriminated among many his own mother, and was executed nonetheless. His poem is now, in my opinion, undervalued. It is, to be sure, a blood and thunder affair, but no worse in that respect than Webster and Turner. In style, Lucan is like Young, a gloomy epigrammatist. and like Seneca, a master of the verbal coup de théâtre. This style was not, so far as I know, imitated in the Middle Ages, but Lucan was regarded with great respect. Dante, in his De Vulgari Eloquentia, mentions him, along with Virgil, Ovid, and Statius, as one of the four regulati poetae. In the noble castle of Limbo, he ranks side by side with Homer, Horace, Ovid, Virgil, and Dante himself. Chaucer, sending his Troilus out into the world, bids it kiss the footprints of Virgil, Ovid, Homer, Lucan, and Stas. The most popular of Lucan's figures was Amyclas, the poor fisherman who ferries Caesar from Palestra to Italy. Lucan uses him as a peg on which to hang the phrase of poverty. Am- Amyclas, he says, was not at all discomposed by Caesar knocking at his door. What temples, what ramparts could boast the like security? Dante translates the passage enthusiastically in the Convivio, and recalls it more beautifully in the Paradiso when he makes Thomas Aquinas say that the bride of St. Francis had long remained without a suitor, despite the fact that he who frightened all the world beside found her unalarmed in the house of, Amyclas. Two of Lucan's great ladies, Julia and Marcia, also appear among the noble and virtuous pagans in the Inferno. The Coniglia, there associated with them, is often taken to be the mother of the Gracchi, but I think she is probably Cornelia, the wife of Pompey, who appears in Lucan as an ideal spouse. Except as evidence of Lucan's popularity, however, these borrowings do not much concern us. Two other passages in Dante are, for our purpose, far more instructive because they reveal the peculiarities of the medieval approach to ancient texts. In his second book, Lucan relates how Marcia, first married to Cato and then at his command to Hortensius, now after Hortensius's death returns to her old husband at his and Rome's darkest hour and demands successfully a remarriage. Though rhetorically treated, it is a moving and a purely human scene. But Dante reads it all allegorically. Marcia is for him la nobile anima, the noble spirit. As a virgin, she represents l'adolescenza, adolescence. As Cato's wife, la gioventute, the children she bore to Cato are the virtues proper to that period of life. Her marriage to Hortensius is senitude, and her children by him are the virtues of the elderly. The death of Hortensius and her widowhood represents the transition to extreme old age, senile. Her return to Cato shows us the noble soul turning to God, and adds Dante, what earthly man was worthier than Cato to symbolize significare God? Absolutely none. Unquote. This astonishingly high estimate of the old suicide helps to explain his later position as usher to purgatory in the comedy. Again, in the same convivio, Dante asserts the existence of the antipodes, right? Opposite foots, the opposite foots, the ones who live on the other side of the earth that you can't get to, and very naturally quotes Albertus Magnus, as good a scientific authority as was then available in support of his view. But the interesting thing is that, not content with this, he also cites Lucan during the desert march in Pharsalia. Chapter 9, one of the soldiers complaining that they were lost in an unknown region of the earth had said, quote, and perhaps Rome herself is now under our feet. Mm. On the opposite side, we're so lost, we accidentally made it through the temperate zone and we're in a totally other world now, is what that would mean. The poet is ranked with the scientist as authority for a purely scientific proposition. All right. So he's citing Lucan as well. He's saying, I'm just citing Lucan as the authority of the fact that this is the way it is, not just the way they thought. This astonishing failure or refusal to distinguish in practice, though not always in theory, between books of different sorts must be borne in mind whenever we are trying to gauge the total effect of an ancient text on its medieval readers. Okay, so this was his point. Dante is using a scientific source and a literary source to prove the fact that the earth has these two regions where you can live with a hot zone in between where you can't. And so he's saying, so notice that the medievals are not distinguishing writings of one type with writings of another when it comes to the authority of what's actually true. The habit, like many medieval habits, long outlived the Middle Ages. Burton is a notable offender. He illustrates the physiological force of imagination from the Aethiopica of Heliodorus as if that romance were a history, and offers us the myth of Orpheus as evidence that beasts can appreciate music. In the long Latin passage on sexual perversions, Pygmalion and Pasiphae are mentioned side by side with modern and historical instances. It is therefore quite possible that Lucan's lengthy account of the abominations practiced by the witch Erichtho may have had a more than literary and a most disastrous influence. Witch hunting tribunals might have had it in mind. But since the great period of witch hunts fell after the Middle Ages, I will not here explore the possibility. What is perhaps Lucan's most important contribution to the model, this is what we're trying to figure out, how they modeled themselves in the world, comes at the beginning of his ninth book, where the soul of Pompey ascends from the funeral pyre to the heavens. This repeats the ascension of Scipio in Cicero's dream, adding new details. Pompey arrives, quote, where the murky air joins the star-bearing wheels, the spheres, that is. He has come to the great frontier between air and ether, between Aristotle's nature and sky. We read about this in our last video just a second ago, the first two chapters. This is clearly at the orbit of the moon. For the region of the air is what lies between the countries of Earth and the lunar movements, inhabited by Simidae Manes, the ghosts of good men who are now demigods. Apparently, they inhabit the very surface of the air, almost in the aether itself, for Lucan describes them as patientes aetheris ami, able to bear, perhaps to breathe, the lowest ether. As if the ether grew more airish or the air more ethereal at their meeting place. Here first, Pompey fills himself. Okay, so we're starting to see regions now, right? We've got the earth level of mortality. We've got the lunar barrier. We've got the aether of divine, infinite, unalterable things. And then we have in this air a sort of a transition, maybe, where there are demigods that can sort of breathe the ether, right? They're great men, but not great enough to transcend back to godness or something like that. So that border of the moon, it's just sort of like a vague region. It's not like a line that like a bowl that keeps this trapped here and that there. It's more like it's a transition, but that moon lunar area, that's where you go from sky to aether or from sky to heaven. Um what were Aristotle's terms for it? Nature to sky, right? Nature to sky or air to aether. The ethereal. Okay, here. Meeting place. Pompey says, here first, Pompey fills himself with, drinks in true light, and sees under how vast a night lies what we call day. Finally, so you see there's a quality to the existence up there that's just more solid and real than where we live. Finally, Ristic sui lidibria trunci. He looked down and saw the mockeries done to his own corpse, which was having a wretched and hugger-mugger funeral. They made him laugh. He was, who cares? Look what they're doing to my body. They're so upset. Who gives a darn? That's all stuff that's in shadow realms. Now I'm in the ether. Every detail of this will meet us again in one author or another. For Englishmen, the passage, as is well known, has another and more particular interest. First, Boccaccio borrowed it in his Tesside and used it for the ghost of his Archita. It went flying up to the concavity of the eighth sphere. There's going to be 8 here at least. Eighth sphere or stellatum, leaving behind it the convex sides, conversi, of the other elementi, which here, as often, are not elements but celestial spheres. Each sphere was naturally concave as he came up to it from beneath, and convex when he looked back on it from above. That of the fixed stars, the stellatum, remains concave because he does not go through and beyond it. He has already gone far higher than Pompeii. Like Scipio, he observes how very small the earth is. Like Pompey, he laughs, but not because his funeral, like Pompey's, is a hole and corner affair. It is the mourning that he laughs at. Chaucer ignored this passage when he was using the Tesside for his Knight's Tale, but used it for the ghost of Troilus. Some have taken the laughter of Troilus to be embittered and ironic. I never thought so. And the descent of the passage, as we have just traced it, seems to me to make it even less probable. I think all 3 ghosts, Pompey's, Architas, and Troilus, Troilus's, laughed for the same reason, laughed at the littleness of all those things that had seemed so important before they died, as we laugh on walking at the trifles or absurdities that loomed so large in our dreams. Oh, C.S. Lewis, we don't read you enough. Part C. Stadius, Claudian, and the Lady Natura. Okay. Stadius, whose Thebaid appeared in the 90s of the first century, ranked in the Middle Ages, as we have already seen with Virgil, Homer, and Lucan. Like Lucan, he strained after the stunning phrase, less successfully, but also less continuously. He had a larger mind than Lucan, more true seriousness, more pity, a more versatile imagination. The Thebaid is a less tiring and a more spacious poem than the Pharsalia. The Middle Ages were quite right to accept it as a noble historical romance. It was, in many ways, especially congenial to them. Its Jupiter was more like the god of monotheism than any other being in the pagan poetry they knew. Its fiends and some of its gods were more like the devils of their own religion than any other pagan spirits. Its deep respect for virginity, with even the curious suggestion that the sexual act, however sanctioned by marriage, is a culpa which needs excuse, appealed to the vein of asceticism in their theology. Finally, the vividness and importance of its personifications, virtues, clementia, pietas, natura, brought it in places very close to the fully allegorical poetry in which they delighted. But I have shot my bolt about these matters elsewhere, and at present natura is my only concern. The reader of Renaissance and medieval literature will have met this lady or goddess fairly often. He will recall that the veiled and numerous nature of Spenser, going back from her, he will meet the more genial but hardly less august nature in Chaucer's Parliament, in de Guilleville's pele- pelerinage, he will be surprised by a nature more sturdy and turbulent than either, a nature with more than a dash of the wife of Bath in her, who sets her arms akimbo and stands up to a superior power in defense of her lawful franchises. Still reascending, he will come to the nature who's so these are all literary characters in different works, obviously named nature, personifications of nature, and we're just tracing it back. He will come to the nature who dominates the romance of the rose for thousands of lines, as vivid as de Gaulleville's, as genial as Chaucer's, as hardly less divine than Spenser's, but far more purposive, far busier than all of them, working unwearied in her contest with death, weeping, repenting, complaining, confessing, receiving penance and absolution, of a beauty that the poet cannot describe. For in her God set the inexhaustible fountain of all beauty, an image of energy and fertility, which at moments takes one's breath away. From her, it is only a step back to Natura, as Alanus brings her in, stiffly robed in rhetoric, conceit, and symbol, pleading again the cause of life or procreation in her Flanctus against the Sodomites, and thence to the two figures of Physis and Natura, who are the heroines of that more sober work, Bernardus de Mundi Universitate. Bernardus de Mundi Universitate. For all this, the student will quite rightly suspect a classical origin. When he turns to those ancients whom the Middle Ages knew, he will find what he is looking for, but he will not find very much of it. The medieval development in quantity and still more in vitality is quite out of proportion to the supplied by antiquity. He will find nothing where he might hope to find it in Plato's Timaeus, the passages in Marcus Aurelius, where Physis is addressed as a deity, will be no use, for they were unknown to in the Middle Ages. The relevant material comes down to not much more than Statius and Claudian. In Statius, Natura is seldom mentioned, but the passages are impressive. In chapter 11, 465, she is the prince, the princeps and creatrix, I think, of all things, certainly of that very passion, pietas, which rebels against her. In 12, she is the dux of those who are fighting a holy war against things monstrous and unnatural. In Claudian, we get a little more. She is the demiurge who reduced primeval chaos to cosmos. She appointed the gods to serve Jupiter. More memorably, she sits, aged yet beautiful, before the ca- before the cavern of Ivum in the Deconsulta, Deconsulata, Deconsulatu Stilichonis. Why the ancients made so little of nature and the medievals so much may be easier to understand after a glance at her history. Nature may be the oldest of things, but Natura is the youngest of deities. Really, ancient mythology knows nothing of her. It seems to me impossible that such a figure could ever arise in a genuinely mythopoeic age. What we call nature worship has never heard of what we call nature. Mother Nature is a conscious metaphor. Mother Earth is something quite different. All Earth, contrasted with all the sky, can be, indeed must be, intuited as a unity. The marriage relationship between Father Sky or Dios and Mother Earth forces itself on the imagination. He is on top, she lies under him. He does things to her, shines, and more importantly, rains upon her and into her. Out of her, in response, come forth the crops, just as calves come out of cows or babies out of wives. In a word, she begets, she bears. You can see it happening. This is genuine mythopoeia. But while the mind is working on that level, what in heaven's name is nature? Where is she? Who has seen her? What does she do? The pre Socratic philosophers of Greece invented nature. They first had the idea, a much odder one than the veil of immemorial familiarity usually allows us to realize, that the great variety of phenomena which surrounds us could all be impounded under a name and talked about as a single object. Later thinkers took over the name and the implication of unity, which, like every name, it carried. But they sometimes used it to cover less than everything. Hence Aristotle's nature, which covers only the sublunary, the things under the moon. In that way, the concept of nature unexpectedly rendered possible a clear conception of the supernatural. Aristotle's God is as supernatural as anything could be. The object, if it is an object called nature, could be personified. And this personification could be there's where you get your supernatural from, by understanding, defining, naming, and having within bounds the concept of nature in relationship to other things. The object, if it is an object called nature, could be personified. And this personification could be either treated as a mere color of rhetoric or seriously accepted as a goddess. That is why the goddess appears so late, long after the real mythopoeic state of mind has passed away. You cannot have the goddess nature till you have the concept nature, and you cannot have the concept until you have begun to abstract. Uh, Let me read this last sentence again. I wonder if I struggle with this because Apollo's a later deity, but not that late, and he's certainly an abstraction. Zeus, I mean, I'm not sure. Hmm. It did come later, and that's all that matters. I'm just not sure I buy his explanation for why it came later. Okay, I'll have to look at that more later. But as long as the concept covers everything, the goddess who personifies the concept is necessarily a jejune and inactive deity, for everything is not a subject about which anything of much interest can be said. All her religious and all her poetic vitality depends on making her something less than everything. If she is at times the object of real religious feeling in Marcus Aurelius, that is because he contrasts or confronts her with the finite individual, with his own rebellious and recalcitrant self. If in Stadius she has moments of poetic life, it is because she is opposed to something better than herself, pietas, or something worse, the unnatural, which, such as incest and fratricide. Of course, there are philosophical difficulties about this opposing to the goddess nature things which the concept nature must certainly include. We may leave Stoics and other pantheists to get out of this scrape as best they can. The point is that the medieval poets were not in the scrape at all. They believed from the outset that nature was not everything. She was created. She was not God's highest, much less his only creature. She had her proper place below the moon. She had her appointed duties as God's vice- vicegerent in that area. Excuse me, I don't often come along words I've never heard. Obviously, it's like a viceroy or something. Vicegerent, a vicegerent. Okay, that's how it's pronounced. Vicegerent, a person exercising delegated power on behalf. It's obviously a viceroy, but a vicegerent is how it's pronounced in that area. Her own lawful subjects stimulated. That's a great word. Stimulated by rebel angels, might disobey her and become unnatural. There were things above her and things below her. It is precisely this limitation and subordination of nature which sets her free from her triumphant poetical career. By surrounding the dull claim to be everything, by surrendering the dull claim to be everything, she becomes somebody. Yet, right? So by giving up the idea of being everything, she's now somebody. Yet all the while, she is, for the medievals, only a personification. A figurative being on these terms is apparently more potent than a deity really believed and who, by being all things, is almost nothing. I'm not sure again on that one, but okay. Certainly the principle makes sense, but I'm not sure that they thought of the other deities differently than that, the way they're thinking of nature. Okay. Before leaving Stadius 1, unless he's looking at the laypersons, perhaps that is his focus. Before leaving Stadius 1, I cannot forbear adding a paragraph which the incurious are invited to skip on a mere curiosity. In the fourth book of the Telebaid, he alludes to a deity he will not name, the sovereign of the threefold world. All right, so this is the God of everything, right? You've got the upper, the lower, and the middle realm where nature is, but this is the sovereign of it all. The same anonymous power is probably meant in Lucan's Pharsalia, where the witch, conjuring a reluctant ghost back into the corpse, threatens it with him. Quo numquam terra vocado, non confusa tremit, qui gorgona sternit apertam. At whose pronounced name earth never failed to tremble, who alone dares see unveiled the Gorgon's face. Luctantius, in his commentary on the Thebaid, says that Stadius means this Greek word, the God whose name it is unlawful to know. This is plain sailing, the demiurge workman being the creator in the Timaeus. But there are two variants in the manuscripts. One is Demogorgona, the other Demogorgon. From the latter of these corruptions, later ages evolved a completely new deity, Demogorgon, who was to enjoy a distinguished literary career in Boccaccio's Genealogy of the Gods, in Spenser, in Milton, and in Shelley. This is perhaps the only time a scribal blunder underwent an apotheosis. Thank you, C.S. Lewis, for telling us all these things. Won't we have more fun reading these other things now that we know something? All right, part D. Apuleius. I'm tempted the entire time I'm reading to pull up these other sources and look at them, but I'm conscious of the fact that we don't have the scope for that. It seems like what's going to happen is this complementary class that we're doing here, just these couple of get-togethers, where we did a bunch on Aristotle and some Platonic sources to further expound upon and elucidate the things that we're reading in Thomas Aquinas as we got through the first two questions. Now we're looking at the way the medievals thought, that this might become the basis of the C.S. Lewis class that's also on our curriculum to eventually do. But for now, we'll just keep doing it the way we're doing it here for this purpose. Apuleius Dideo Socrates. Apuleius, born in Numidia around 125 AD. So we're again, he's starting with the ancients, he's getting closer to the medieval, and he's going to start tracing all of these literary ideas here and show us how they think. The medievals think if something's in writing, it's probably true. I got to make a model of all these true things from these various scientific, philosophical, theological, pagan, Judeo classical sources. I got to find a way to make them all merge since they're all kind of true. So let's see what his literary evidence is here. All right, we're up to 125 AD, is now usually and undeservedly remembered for his curious romance, The Metamorphoses or Golden Ass, Apuleius. For a medievalist, however, his essay on the god of Socrates is more important. We knew that's what we were reading, right? Okay. Two passages from Plato underlie it. One is in the Apology, where Socrates explains why he abstained from political life. The reason, he says, is one you have often heard me mention: something divine and daimonic happened to me. It has been so ever since I was a boy, right? We remember Socrates as daemon. That's what he's referring to. There comes a voice which, whenever I hear it, always forbids something I am about to do, but never commands, right? We all know this story. Socrates had a daemon, and the daemon never told him what to do, but only ever told him what not to do. If he was about to do something like lie, it always told him to tell the truth instead. And he, unlike all other men, he explains the reason why I'm different is that I always listen to the daemon. God and daemon, as present here in their adjectives, divine and daimonic, may be synonyms, as I take it. They often are for other Greek writers, both in prose and verse. But in the second passage, Symposium 202 to 203, Plato draws a clear distinction between them, which was to be influential for centuries. Daemons and daemons are their creatures of a middle nature between gods and men, like Milton's middle spirits betwixt the angelic and humankind. Through these intermediaries, and through them alone, we mortals have any intercourse with the gods. 4, we really need a Greek speaker, so if you're watching I forgot to share the link for joining on this one. Let me do that right now. Let me hasten to do that. Okay, so if you're watching this on X, in the comments, there will be a link, and if you speak Greek, like I know some of you do, let me actually send this right to one of our Greek speakers. See if she has time to come in here and join us. Um, you can come in and help this poor American who can't even pronounce anything properly read some of this properly. For blah blah blah, as Apuleius translates it, nullus Deus miscitor hominibus. No God converses with men. Okay, there are none that are divine having conversations with the humans. The voice that spoke to Socrates was that of a daemon, not a god. All right. So now we've got 3 layers above us, right? There's the human, there's the angelic, the divine. Maybe that's the same, maybe that's distinguishable, but there's this daemonic, which is the spirit realm that can communicate with us. There's like inspiration from the divine, right? These layers that we're going to see, the 8 layers, they're sort of like wheels, and by the time you get to the industrial revolution, it becomes quite mechanical, but these are um spheres of influence, okay? And the things outside bump and push and make the things, the layer beneath them, to start doing things. And that's how the divine can communicate with us. And he's saying in this original source here in 125 AD, the distinction between the daemonic, not exactly demonic, but daemonic, the daemonic and the divine and the human is already being written about. About these middle spirits or daemons, Apuleius has much to tell us. They naturally inhabit the middle region between earth and aether, that is, the air, which extends upwards as far as to the orbit of the moon. All is, in fact, so arranged that every part of nature may have its appropriate animals. At first sight, he admits, we might suppose that birds provide the appropriate animals for the air, but they are quite inadequate. They do not ascend above the higher mountain tops. Ratio demands that there should be a species genuinely native to the air, right? And just like they can sort of breathe the aether, maybe they have the ability sometimes to fly into the God realm a little bit, because we saw earlier in some of the writings, it's a little bit transitional there around the moon's orbit. Likewise, maybe the earthly mortal creatures like birds can kind of fly a little bit into the air, but there's got to be a genuinely native to the air creature, as gods are to the aether and men are to earth. I, sh- I should be hard put to it to choose any single English word as the right translation of ratio in this context. Reason, method, fitness, and proportion might all put in a claim. Okay. It's it's proper and appropriate and necessary, reasonable that there should be something like that, that there should be creatures that are properly air like. The daemons have bodies of a finer consistency than clouds, which are not normally visible to us. It is because they have bodies that he calls them animals. Obviously, he does not mean that they are beasts. They are rational, aerial animals. We are, as we are rational, terrestrial animals, and the gods proper are rational, ethereal animals. So this picture is just to the 125 AD, but we're starting to see the model that has to be created with the 8 layers that the medievals are gonna be using, 8 or 9. The idea that even the highest created spirits, the gods, are distinct from God, were after their own fashion incarnate, had some sort of material vehicle, goes back to Plato. He had called the true gods, the deified stars, animals. Scholasticism in regarding the angels, which is what the gods or ethereal creatures are called in Christian language as pure or naked spirits, right? Without bodies like like the airy daemons, but they're still not on the realm of God, was revolutionary. So it was revolutionary to have those to have there be an angelic realm that's higher than earth, but less than heaven, kind of, in a sense, the creatures that live there. That's a revolution from this other idea that there's just kind of airy bodies. You can't really see them. They're not even as clear as water droplets that are in the sky making clouds, but they're rational, and that's the realm that they govern in, just as we govern in the terrestrial. The Florentine, and as God governs in the ethereal, the Florentine Platonists reverted to the older view. All right, so there's some medieval thinkers who are going to revert to the yeah, it's kind of like their airy bodies. It's bodies, but it's not naked spirit, whereas the Christian tends to be its naked spirit without body. The daemons are between us and the gods, not only locally and materially, but qualitatively as well. Like the impassible gods, they are immortal. Like mortal men, they are passable. Some of them, before they became daemons, lived in terrestrial bodies, were in fact men. They ascended, right? We've seen that. This is why Pompey saw semidae manes, demigod ghosts in the airy region. But this is not true of all daemons. Some, such as sleep and love, were never human. From this class, an individual daemon or genus, the standard Latin translation of daemon, is allotted to each human being as his witness and guardian through life. Right. So the Latin translation is just genus or genius, right? Where we get the word genie. So genius, not genus. So daemon, Greek and Latin, genius, inspiration, right? It would and it's where we get the word genie, which is also a spirit that's flying through the air on a carpet or in a jar or something. It would detain us too long here to trace the steps whereby a man's genius, from being an invisible personal and external attendant, became his true self, and then his cast of mind, and finally, among the romantics, his literary or artistic gifts. To understand this process fully would be to grasp that great movement from inter internalization and that consequent aggrandizement of man and desic desiccation of the outer universe, in which the psychological history of the West has so largely consisted. Okay, that would be something worth getting into beyond the scope of what we're doing here, though. Apart from its direct contributions to the model, and again, what we're after here is looking at literary sources that give us a hint to how the medievals conceptualized themselves in the world that they lived in, and not forgetting the fact that astrophysics and cosmology are two different things. Their scientists have fully understanding that the earth is round and all of that, but they also have these ideas about how we relate to different qualities of being, and we put a place for those beings. And so this is all being worked out in real time because the model, he says, of the medievals has to take into account all of these varied literary sources and try to incorporate them all as true, because it has a hard time saying any of them are false. All right. So, apart from its direct contributions to the model, this little work has a twofold value for those who are embarking on medieval studies. In the first place, it illustrates the sort of channel through which scraps of Plato, often scraps which were very marginal and unimportant in Plato's own work, trickled down to the Middle Ages. Of Plato himself, they had little more than an incomplete Latin version of a single dialogue, the Timaeus, that by itself perhaps would hardly have sufficed to produce a Platonic period. But they also received a diffuse Platonism, inexorably linked with Neoplatonic elements indirectly through such authors as Apuleius and those whom we shall be considering in the next chapter. These, with the Platonici, whom St. Augustine read, Latin leaders of the Neoplatonists, provided the intellectual atmosphere in which the new Christian culture grew up. The Platonism of the early ages was therefore something very different from that of either the Renaissance or of the 19th century. In the second place, Apuleius introduces us to two principles, unless indeed they are really the same principle, which will meet us again and again as we proceed. One of those principles, one, is what I call the principle of the triad. The clearest statement of it in Plato himself comes from the Timaeus. It is impossible, quote, it is impossible that two things should be joined together without a third, right? There's the yin, the yang, and the line between them notion. There must be some bond in between, there you go, both to bring them together. Okay. The principle is not stated, but assumed in the assertion of the symposium that God does not meet man. They can encounter one another only indirectly. There must be some wire, some medium, some introducer, some bridge, a third thing of some sort in between them. Daemons fill the gap in 125 in 125 AD. We shall find Plato himself in the medievals endlessly acting on their principle, supplying bridges, as it were, third things between reason and appetite, soul and body, king and commons. That's definitely what you see. And in our other year two course, this one we're doing Aquinas, but in our other one, we read the Platos of Dialogue called Dialoguing with Plato. And you definitely will see that if you keep an eye out for it now. The other is the principle of plenitude. If between aether and earth there is a belt of air, then it seems that to Apuleius, Ratio herself demands that it should be inhabited, right? If you've got an aether with the divine in it, and you've got the terrestrial with the humans on it, and you have a middle area, there should be a reasonable creature that lives there and rules there. Those are the daemons. The universe must be fully exploited. Nothing must go to waste. It's just a principle. It's like an assumption, is what we'll think of it as for now. Okay, so we're starting with the early classical part as we're trying to put together the process and the thinking processes that formed this model that the medievals and Renaissance authors of fiction and literary works used, and how they thought of the world, and therefore how every one of the popular works they produced resonated with the laypersons who also must have been thinking of the world in those ways, in a two-way conversation sort of way, of course, as it affected the way they thought of things. All right, let's see how far we've made it. All right, so the point of this was to start studying C.S. Lewis's Discarded Image in an effort to understand better the way, because we're reading through Aquinas' Summa Theologica, the way that Aquinas and the way that Aristotle thought as well, because a lot of this comes from Aristotle. So what we did is we did 6 or so lectures reading through the Summa Theologica. We've made it through 2 questions already. One divided into 10 questions and one divided into 3 and blah, 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 all the great distinctions and divisions. And then we did a class on Aristotle as looking at the influence. So we just read Aquinas. Oh my gosh, we're reading the exact same thing in Aristotle. So Roger led that, and we got to see all the places where Aquinas wore out his Control C and Control V buttons on his keyboard without being too dismissive of Aquinas, of course. And then, you're not plagiarizing if you're improving, which you might be doing. That argument's open there. And then we did a video where we looked at a lot of maybe other sources in philosophy that perhaps disagreed with Aquinas, where Aquinas has his objector speaking and then he's answering him. And we gave some voice to some of that. There's some more that we might do. on that as well. I might do a part 2 on that one, but we did that, and now what we're doing is we're looking at this book, The Discarded Image by C.S. Lewis, which was compiled together from lectures and turned into a book, lectures they had given on Oxford, where he effortlessly quotes these lines of poetry from a period of about 1,500 years that demonstrate the way that the medievals were thinking about cosmology and the separation between cosmology and astrophysics, because he knows they understood the roundness of the earth. They understood all these things in a physical sense, but they also wanted to know how they should be placing themselves in relationship to other types of beings like the divine and where those might dwell and all of that sort of thing. So that's what we're studying. And we just got through chapter 3, which is the first one where we actually get into those texts and look at, oh, there we go, and look at what insights he can show us from those things. What I wish I had done was read this alone on my own and put together all the literary sources so we could look at those, but then these videos would get far too long probably. Um, we might do that at some point in the future, or if somebody's listening and would like to do that, listen through this video and the last video where we've been reading through the discarded image and go dig up the original sources and read them. And you can put a video together and we'll add it to the university. We'll add it to the website. We'll bring you on here if you've got a slideshow or something, and we'll do it that way. If you're curious to do so, obviously in the literary curriculum that we have in the university, we're going to be reading Milton and Dante and all of that stuff as well. Okay, let's have another simultaneous sip and let's start chapter 5. Or I'm sorry, chapter 4. For those just joining, there's a link on X. We'll upload it to YouTube later. But there's a link in the comments of where you're watching this on X right now, where you can click that, come in here. If you're on a phone, scroll down because there's an extra join button that you still need to hit. But once you've done all that, I'll see you pop up here and we can add you to the video and you can have conversations with us about this and add your thoughts and objections and arguments and everything else that you'd like to do, other sources and examples that you have of these things. In the meantime, grab your cup, your mug, your glass, your tankard, your chalice, your thermos or your stein, your canteen, your jug, your flask, your vessel of any kind, and fill it with your favorite liquid. I'm going to drink water today. And join me now for the unparalleled, nothing parallels this. It is alone, unparalleled pleasure, the dopamine hit of the day, the thing that makes everything, literally everything better. It's called the simultaneous sip, and I'm going to sip it with you right now. Go. Ah, what a boost simultaneity can give you. Chapter 4, selected materials, the seminal period. And out of old felders, of old felds, as men seeth, cometh at these new corn. So, and out of old fields, as men seeth, cometh at this new corn, by Chaucer. I'm not the guy to be doing these pronunciation things either. I feel horrible. If anybody out there is a scholar of these things and wants to pronounce things properly, please click the link and join us. Absolutely happy to let you be the voice of pronouncing things properly. I'm American. We are mentally incapable of pronouncing things properly. I think as Rushdie coined us, or one of his characters did in a novel, the great land of mispronunciation. All right, here we go. All the texts we have hitherto looked at belong unambiguously to the Old World, to pagan antiquity. We now turn to the transitional period, which can be regarded as beginning very roughly with the birth of Plotinus. Plotinus in 205. Here we go. We've made it up to 205. And ending with the first datable reference to Pseudo Dionysius in 533. This was the age which brought the characteristically medieval frame of mind into being. It also witnessed the last stand of paganism and the final triumph of the church. Cardinal dates in that story are 324, when Constantine urged his subjects to embrace Christianity, 331 to 63, the reign of Julian and his attempted pagan revival, 384, when the elder Symmachus pleaded in vain that the altar of victory should be restored to the Senate House, and 390, when Theodi- The- Theodosius, Theodosius forbade all pagan worship. Theodosius forbade all pagan worship. As Camille Paglia points out, Western culture up to this day is still a dialogue, an intertwining, a wrestling match between pagan and Christian influence. I mean, obviously, there's other influence as well, but primarily you can see it that way. And she looks at art in the modern day, and I can't wait to do a course on Camille Paglia. I've been wanting to do that forever. I found some students that would be interested in it, and it all fell apart. But boy, would that be a fun thing to do. It's in the curriculum. We'll get to it eventually. In a prolonged war, the troops on both sides may imitate one another's methods and catch one another's epidemics. They may even occasionally fraternize. Fraternize. So, in this period, the conflict between the old and the new religion was often bitter, and both sides were ready to use coercion when they dared. But at the same time, the influence of the one upon the other was very great. During these centuries, much that was of pagan origin was built irremovably into the model. It is characteristic of the age that more than one of the works I shall mention has sometimes raised a doubt whether its author was pagan or Christian. The precise nature, and even in some senses, the width of the chasm which separated the religions can easily be mistaken if we take our ideas solely from political or ecclesiastical histories. I mean, that can't possibly have been more proven than the studies we did in our first 6 videos, especially video 6. We're reading Aquinas' argument for the existence of God. Go to video 7. We're reading Aristotle saying all the exact same things. I mean, okay, let's continue. Precise nature, and even in some senses, the width of the chasm which separated the religions, can easily be mistaken if we take our ideas solely from the political or ecclesiastical histories. Still more if we take them from more popular sources. Cultured people on both sides had the same education, read the same poets, learned the same rhetoric. As was shown 60 odd years ago, social relations between them were sometimes friendly. I've read a novel which represented all the pagans of that day as carefree sensualists and all the Christians as savage ascetics. It is a grave error. They were in some ways far more like each other than either was like a modern man. The leaders on both sides were monotheists, and both admitted almost an infinity of supernatural beings between God and man. Both were highly intellectual, both also, by our standards, highly superstitious. By our standards. The last champions of paganism were not the sort of men that Swinburne or the modern humanist would wish them to have been. They were not lusty extroverts recoiling in horror or contempt from a world grown gray with the breath of the pale Galilean. If they wanted to get back the laurel, the palms, and the paean, it was on most serious and religious grounds. If they longed to see the breasts of the nymph in the brake, their longing was not like a satyr's. It was much more like a spiritualist's. A world-renouncing ascetic and mystical character that marked the most eminent pagans, no less than their Christian opponents. It was the spirit of the age. Everywhere, on both sides, men were turning away from the civic virtues and the sensual pleasures to seek an inner purgation and a supernatural goal. Influence from the cynics. We remember cynic doesn't mean, oh, it's all done. The ancient cynics just believed there was nothing better you could do with your time than worry about your soul and get it right. And just don't bother yourself with all this other money making and politics, honor seeking, and sexual pursuits and all of the pleasures of food. Like, forget all of that stuff. Just get your soul right. Okay, so that's influential here. And he's saying equally on the pagans who are saying, I want to think of the world as the rivers are inhabited by the daughters of deities that predate Zeus And then this is the realm that Zeus was like, I want to think of it that way as a spiritual and intellectual principle, not because I want to see some titties. Okay. And so he's saying they were very, very much more alike to each other than either of them are to us. The modern who dislikes the Christian fathers would have disliked the pagan philosophers equally and for similar reasons. Both alike would have embarrassed him with stories of visions, ecstasies, and apparitions. Between the lower and more violent manifestations of both religions, he would have found it hard to choose. To a modern eye and nostril, Julian, with his long nails and densely populated beard, might have seemed very like an unwashed monk out of the Egyptian desert. It will occur to everyone that in an age of conflict, those authors whose allegiance has been doubted may have deliberately made it doubtful through caution. This is always a possible hypothesis, but not a necessary one. All right. So some people have said, well, I can't tell if this guy's pagan or Christian. Maybe he was afraid that the one team would see him on the other team and be upset at him. Sure, that's possible. Or maybe, just maybe, it's the beginning seeds of what C.S. Lewis is saying characterize one of the things that characterize the medieval mind, which is we got to assimilate these things because they're all true. So let's find a model that makes sense of them all. Where so much ground was, or at least seemed to be common, a writer could sincerely produce much that was acceptable to many Christians and many pagan readers alike, provided his work was not explicitly theological. All right. Yeah, you might have been pretending and trying to have an open audience. Hey, everybody can read my book. It's you can't tell what I am. Yeah, maybe. Or maybe you are both those things at the same time and you're writing to people who are both those things at the same time. And as long as I'm not explicitly arguing about a point of doctrine or something like that, this is how I view the world. And it's how you view the world, which is why you're buying the book and reading it and talking about it. The remoter religious implications of philosophical positions were not always grasped. Hence, what we might take to be the difference between a clearly Christian and a possibly pagan work may really be the difference between a thesis offered, so to speak, to the faculty of philosophy and one offered to that of divinity. This seems to me to be the best explanation of the gulf that separates Boethius's De Consolatione from the doctrinal pieces which are, I presume, rightly attributed to him. It's quite a cool idea, huh? All of you ex-dwellers who are fighting paganism, yay, no, it's Christianity. Well, study your Christianity more and find out how pagan it is. Hey, study your Aristotle a bit more, you pagans, and find out how it's pushing you towards Christianity, whether you like it or not. C.S. Lewis is pointing out that you modern X users, from whatever you come from, are not quite understanding either very well. That does not to say that they're the same thing. There are still quarrels about doctrine. You could still have a theological text and bicker about points and stuff like that, but they're much more similar to each other than you think. So much so that whole civilizations, including the medievals, are can be engaged in and flourish while engaging in the project of assimilating in harmonious fashion into a model all of these different ideas. Okay, on its highest level, the pagan resistance can almost be identified with the Neoplatonic school. In it, the great names are those of Plotinus, Porphyr, Porphyry, Iamblichus, and Proclus. The first was a genius of the highest order, but Porphyry, and even he often indirectly, was the principal influence in the West. The whole school, while partly a spontaneous development of the Greek genius, seems to me to be also a deliberate response to the challenge of Christianity, and in that respect, indebted to it. In it, the last pagans are carefully dissociating themselves from popular polytheism and saying, in effect, we too have an explanation of the whole universe. We too have a systematic theology. We, no less than you, have a ruler of life, have saints, miracles, devotions, and the hope of union with the highest. All right. There's clashes, there's borrowing, there's fraternizing, there's warring. It's not just a simple division of our team versus your team, and we're totally different. The present study, however, is interested not in the short lived impact of the new religion on the old, but with the enduring effect of the old upon the new. Uh-huh. The last and Neoplatonic wave of paganism, which had gathered up into itself much from the preceding waves, Aristotelian, Platonic, Stoic, and whatnot, came far inland and made brackish lakes which have perhaps never been drained. What a nice metaphor. This ocean is just, and then it's leaving that salt water there. It's still a part of your country. It's part of the way you view things. Not all Christians at all times have detected them or admitted their existence. And among those who have done so, there have always been two attitudes. There was then and is still a Christian left, eager to detect and anxious to banish every pagan element, but also a Christian right who, like St. Augustine, could find the doctrine of the Trinity foreshadowed in the Platonici, or could claim triumphantly, like Justin Martyr, whatever things have been well said by all men belong to us Christians. Okay. Whatever things have been well said by all men belong to us Christians. C.S. Lewis is often attributed with this quotation himself when he says, all truth is God's truth. So if you study Plato and you find some truth there, if you're a Christian, you shouldn't say, no, I didn't. No, I didn't. All the truth is in the Bible. You should, according to this perspective, incorporate it in your model. All truth is God's truth is a quote that people often attribute to C.S. Lewis. So that's just to tip the hand a bit and say that he actually thinks like this himself, although he's not telling us what he thinks here. He's just talking about how these medievals thought. He seems to think it's not a bad way of thinking, though. Okay, part A. Chalcidius. The work of Chalcidius is an incomplete translation of Plato's Timaeus, stopping at the end of 53b, the line that is about halfway through, and a much longer commentarius. This is hardly what we should call a commentary, for it ignores many difficulties and expatiates freely on matters about which Plato had little or nothing to say. Okay. It is dedicated to one Osius or Hosius, who has been identified not very certainly with the bishop of Cordova, who attended the Council of Nicaea. Even if the identification is correct, this would not enable us to date the work very closely, for we are told by Isidore that the bishop lived to be over 100. The religion of Chalcidius has been questioned. In favor of his Christianity, we note the dedication to Osius, always assuming that he really was the bishop. He calls the biblical account of Adam's creation the teaching of a holier sect. And after glancing at a supposed astrological doctrine in Homer, he mentions the star of the Nativity as something vouched for by a holier and more venerable story. 4, he describes himself as deriving from the divine law truths to which Plato had been guided by the impulse or instinctus of truth herself. So those 4 things can be taken as evidence that perhaps he was Christian. On the other hand, when he draws on the Old Testament, instead of calling it the sacred writings, he usually says merely that he is following the Hebrae as witnesses to the benefits we mortals have received from good daemons. He summons all Greeks, Latins, and barbarians, cuncta gratiae, omne latium, omnisque barbaria. This is a sharp contrast with St. Augustine's view that all the daemons of paganism were evil, were demons in the latter sense of the word. 3, in one place, he treats the divine inspiration of Moses as something open to doubt, ut frunt. 4, he cites Homer, Hesiod, and Empedocles as if they were no less to be taken into account than the sacred writers. So he's not just saying he's citing them, but it's the way he's citing them. 5, he describes providence as nous or mind, a being which holds the second place after the summus deus, by whom it is perfected as it perfects all other things. This is very much more like a Neoplatonic trinity than the Christian. 6, He discusses at great length whether Silva, matter, is inherently evil, without once mentioning the Christian doctrine that God made all things and pronounced them very good. Okay, but Paul, the whole flesh versus spirit thing, I mean, that's still in Christianity, which of course could be because it's borrowing from the Neoplatonists here, but we're trying to offer evidence on both sides that this guy was either Christian or pagan. 7, he wholly rejects the anthropocentric cosmology of Genesis, in which the heavenly bodies are made, quote, to give light upon the earth. He holds it would be absurd to suppose that the blessed and eternal things above the moon were ordered for the sake of the perishable things below. The two last items are less evidential than we might at first suppose, though Christians were logically bound to admit the goodness of matter. That doctrine was not heartily relished. That doctrine was not heartily relished. Then and for centuries, the language of some spiritual writers was hardly to be reconciled with it. And I think that there remained throughout the Middle Ages an unresolved discord between those elements in their religion which tended to an anthropocentric view and those in the model which made man a marginal, almost as we shall see, a suburban creature. All right, so the last two could be Christian or pagan, he's saying maybe, but we'll count them as light evidence that he might have been pagan against the evidence that more solid that he was pagan and the evidence more solid that he was Christian. For the rest, I think Chalcidius is a Christian writing philosophically. Okay, so he's going to take it all into account and he's going to say, my judgment is that he's a Christian writing philosophically. What he accepted as matters of faith were excluded as matters of faith from his thesis. Biblical writers, well, so just like Aquinas, he might be religious, but he's going to try to do philosophy and base everything off of reason. And so his arguments aren't going to just be saying, I quote the Bible for the Bible tells me so. And it doesn't have to always be the biblical doctrine. It's just that he's trying to reason about things that maybe he thought were extra scriptural or whatever. Biblical writers might therefore appear in his works as eminent authors to be taken into account like any other eminent authors, but not treated as the oracles of God. That would have been contrary to the rules of his art. He could be a methodological purist, as we shall see later. Of the deep discrepancy between his Neoplatonic Trinity and the fully Christian doctrine, I believe him to have been unaware. By translating so much of the Timaeus and thus transmitting it to centuries in which little else of Plato was known. All right, so he's saying, look, I can explain away that as that's actually what he thought was a Christian idea. We can see it as Neoplatonic, but he just didn't understand that it was that. Or maybe he wanted the Christian to evolve in that direction. Okay. By translating so much of the Timaeus and thus transmitting it to centuries in which little else of Plato was known, Chalcidius determined what the name of Plato should chiefly stand for throughout the Middle Ages. The Timaeus has none of the erotic mysticism we find in the Symposium or the Phaedrus, and almost nothing about politics. And though the ideas or forms are mentioned, their real place in Plato's theory of knowledge is not displayed. For Chalcidius, they become ideas, almost in the modern sense, thoughts in the mind of God. That's a thing that's been observed by other academics. Plato, we're studying Aquinas, which means we're studying Aristotle, but Plato had these forms. By the time you get to Aquinas, the forms are ideas in the mind of God. It thus came about that for the Middle Ages, Plato was not the logician, nor the philosopher of love, nor the author of the Republic. He was, next to Moses, the great monotheistic cosmogonist, the philosopher of creation, hence, paradoxically, the philosopher of that nature which the real Plato so often disparaged. Yes, he did. To that extent, Chalcidius unconsciously supplied a corrective for the contemptus mundi, the contempt for matter, for the world, inherent in Neoplatonism and early Christianity alike. It was later to prove fruitful. As his choice of the Timaeus was momentous, so was the fashion in which he treated it. His admitted principle of interpretation was one which makes an author more liable to be misrepresented the more it is revered. In hard places, he holds, we must always attribute to Plato whatever sense appears worthiest the wisdom of so great an authority, which inevitably means that all the dominant ideas of the commentator's own age will be read into them. Plato clearly said that the soul of wicked men may be reincarnated as women, and if that doesn't cure them, finally as beasts. But we are not, says Chalcidius, to suppose that he meant it literally. He only means that by indulging your passions, you will in this present life become more and more like an animal. In Timaeus, Plato, after describing how God created the gods, not the mythological ones, but those he really believed in, the animated stars, asks what is to be said about the popular pantheon. He first degrades them from the rank of gods to that of daemons. He then proceeds, in words almost certainly ironical, to decline any further discussion of them. It is, he says, a task quite beyond me. We must accept what was said about them by our ancestors, who, according to their own account, were actually their descendants. Surely they must have been well informed about their own progenitors. That does sound quite sarcastic. And who could disbelieve the children of the gods? Yeah. Chalcidius takes all this au pied de la lettre. Oh, he takes it by the letter? By telling us to believe our forebears, Plato is reminding us that credulitas must precede all instruction. Oh, yeah, what's clearly ironic from Socrates. All right, let's see what this means then. And if he declines to discuss further the nature of the daemons, it is not for Chalcidius because he thought the subject was not a philosopher's business. What he suggests as the real reason reveals the vein of methodological pedantry which I have attributed to him. Plato, he says, is here writing as a natural philosopher, and it would have been inconvenientness. It would have been inconvenient, would have been a solecism to say more about the daemons. Daemonology belongs to the higher discipline called epipteika, and Epictetus was one who had been initiated into the mysteries, right? All of that does seem like textual evidence for C.S. Lewis's take on Chalcidius here, that he's basically trying to do philosophy and doesn't really want to get into mystical stuff. Um, a very brief reference to dreams in the original leads to 7 chapters on them in the commentary. Okay, a very brief reference leads to 7 chapters. These are of interest for 2 reasons. In the first place, they include a translation of Republic 571 and thus hand on ages before Freud, Plato's Freudian doctrine of the dream as the expression of a submerged wish. Bonko knows about it. In the second place, they throw light on a passage in Chaucer. Chalcidius lists the types of dreams, and his list does not exactly agree with the better known classification of Macrobius. Macrobius. It includes, however, the revelatio, a type vouchsafe for by Hebraca Philosophia. It will be so like revelations, like the gods are talking to you through your dreams. It will be remembered that Chaucer in the Aur de Fame, though otherwise reproducing the classification of Macrobius, adds one more type, the revelation. He doubtless derived it, though perhaps indirectly, from Chalcidius. Astronomy in Chalcidius has not yet fully settled down in its medieval form. Like everyone else, he declares that the Earth is infinitesimally small by cosmic standards, but the order of the planets is still open to dispute, nor are their names yet irrevocably fixed. He gives, here agreeing with the Aristotelian de Mundo, Phaenon as an alternative to Saturn, Phaethon to Jupiter, Pyrrhus to Mars, Stilbun to Mercury, and either Lucifer or Hesperus to Venus. He also holds that the diverse and multiple motions of the planets is the real source, the auctoritatum, the actual dedit, the actual cause of all the effects that now come to pass. All that is suffered, functe passiones, is this in this mutable world below the moon has its origin from them. But he is careful to add that such influence upon us is not in any sense the purpose for which they exist. It is a mere byproduct. They run the course appropriate to their beatitude. And our contingent affairs imitate that felicity in such halting fashion as they can. Thus, for Chalcidius, the geocentric universe is not in the least anthropomorphic. If we ask what a thing to observe, okay? The geocentric universe for Chalcidius is not anthropocentric. Stick that in your pipe and smoke it for a second. How great our Copernican revolutions are. We're moving ourselves away from being the center of the subject. Those silly old people used to think humans were at the center of everything. Geocentricity as a concept does not imply anthropocentricity. If we ask, I mean, look at how much Chalcidius is emphasizing that these stars are not doing anything for us. They're greater than us. It's incidental, the effect they have on us. All right. If we ask why, nevertheless, the earth is central, he has a very unexpected answer. It is so placed in order that the celestial dance may have a center to revolve about, in fact, as an ascetic convenience for the celestial beings. It is perhaps because his universe is already so well and radiantly by the inhabited that Chalcidius, though he mentions the Pythagorean doctrine, which peopled the moon and other planets with mortals, is not interested in it. Nothing will seem stranger to a modern than the series of chapters which Chalcidius entitles On the Utility of Sight and Hearing. The primary value of sight is not for him its survival value. The important thing is that sight begets philosophy. Um, the fact that he would even say such a thing is more evidence that C.S. Lewis has nailed him, that he is primarily trying to do philosophy. For, quote, no man would seek God nor aspire to piety unless he had first seen the sky and the stars. God gave men eyes in order that they might observe the wheeling movements of mind and providence in the sky, and then in the movements of their own souls try to imitate as nearly as they can that wisdom, serenity, and peace. This is all genuine Plato from Timaeus, though hardly the Plato we learn most of at a modern university. Well, it is the Plato we learn of in our university for sure. You know, those of you who've been dialoguing with Plato with us and been reading the Platonic dialogues will not find this idea a new one. Well, we don't have to even recount it right now, but that stuff up there really matters. We're stumbling around here. The real truth is up there. All right. Similarly, hearing exists principally for the sake of music. Ooh, nice one. The native operations of the soul are related to the rhythms and modes, patterns of being, but this relationship fades in the soul because of her union with the body, and therefore the souls of most men are out of tune. The remedy for this is music, not that sort which delights the vulgar, but that divine music which never departs from understanding and reason. We see how this is Neoplatonic, no? Though Chalcidius had invented a reason for Plato's reticence on the subject of daemons, he does not follow his example. His account of them differs in some respects from their given by Apuleius. He denies the Pythagorean or Empedoclean belief that dead men became daemons. All daemons are for him a distinct species And he applies the name daemons to the ethereal as well as to the aerial creatures, the former being those whom the Hebrews call holy angels. But he is completely at one with Apuleius in affirming the principle of plenitude. And so he also still agrees with that principle and that of the triad. Aether and air, like earth, must be populated, lest any region be left void, lest the perfection of the universe anywhere, should anywhere go limping. And since there exist that's an interesting idea. The role that consciousness plays in all being. There have to be, like there are rational creatures, humans that rule over the terrestrial. There must be a daemons that rule over the sky, aether area, and there's the God who rules over the aether, according to the others, or the outside, even the aether, divine realm. Okay. And since there exist divine, immortal, celestial, and stellar creatures, and also temporal, mortal, earthly, and passable creatures, it is inevitable that between these two there must exist some mean to connect the extremes, as we see in harmony. We need not doubt that the voice which issued prohibitions to Socrates came from God. But we may be equally sure that it is not the voice of God itself. Between the purely intelligible God and the earthly corporeal Socrates, there would be no unmediated conversation, conciliatio. God spoke to him through some intermediate being. We may seem to be moving here in a world utterly alien to the Christians, but we shall find statements of not unlike this of Chalcidius in authors whose Christianity has never been questioned. So it's not fully alien to Christianity to think like this. So far, Chalcidius is on common ground with Apuleius. He then proceeds to another application of the triad. The cosmic triad can be envisaged not only as a harmony, but as a polity, a triad of sovereign, executive, and subjects. The stellar powers command. Again, you see Plato. The stellar powers command. I mean, I don't know if I should just keep saying that or if I don't want to distract us too much, but you have the rational soul, uh, the heart that seeks for honor, and the appetitive soul, right? You have this triad, and this one must rule the heart and the stomach. And okay, the angelic beings execute, and the terrestrial obey. All right, so the God realm, stellar powers command, the angelic beings execute, and the terrestrials obey. Then, following the Timaeus and the Republic, he finds the same triadic pattern repeated in the ideal state and in the human individual. Okay, he does all of that. In his imagined city, Plato assigned the highest parts to his philosophical rulers who command. After them comes the warrior caste who carries out their orders. Finally, the common people obey. So in each man, the rational part lives in the body citadel. I didn't have to say this. That is in the head, in the citadel, the head. In the camp or barracks, castra of the chest, the warrior like the energy which resembles anger or a search for honor, if we're reading Plato, that which makes a man high spirited has its station to execute things that you've rationally decided should be done. And then the appetitive, the appetite, which corresponds to the common people, is located in the abdomen below them both. It will be seen how faithfully their triadic conception of psychological health reflects either the Greek or the latter medieval idea of the nurture proper to a freeman or a knight. Reason and appetite must not be left facing one another across a no man's land. A trained sentiment of honor or chivalry must provide the mean that unites them and integrates the civilized man. Okay? Notice how much he's tracing these intellectual legacies right up through the medieval and Renaissance, which we're meant to understand here. But it is equally important for its cosmic implications. These were fully drawn out centuries later in the magnificent passage where Alinus ab Insulis compares the sum of things to a city. In the central castle, in the Empyrean, the emperor sits enthroned. In the lower heavens live the angelic knighthood. We on earth are outside the city wall. How, we ask, can the Empyrean be the center when it is not only on, but outside the circumference of the whole universe. Because, as Dante was to say more clearly than anyone else, the spatial order is the opposite of the spiritual, and the material cosmos mirrors, hence reverses the reality, so that what is truly the rim seems to us the hub. Mm. Mind blown, pause, holy mackerel. We're trying to read Aquinas. We're trying to understand the way the medievals thought. We're studying Aristotle and saying, oh my God, they thought like that. We know why, because it's Aquinas and it's scholastic, and we've talked about that at great length. Also, the Platonic, we've been bringing it up and we've been seeing it mentioned and all of that. We don't understand the way the medievals thought. This book is going to help us. Oh, they thought the earth was at the center of everything because they were so important and everything else revolves around us. We're very Copernican and scientific. We know that we have put the subject out to the extreme and we're just studying the objective reality. And oh, surprise, surprise, might be tough for you to deal with, but come to terms with the fact that you're a tiny little insignificant speck on an insignificant speck and you're way out in a suburb of the cosmos and blah, 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 blah. What C.S. Lewis is pointing out is read their poetry and read their philosophical texts. What they were saying was start here and move up and out. And everything looks concave from the inside, but it looks convex from the outside. And if you're out in that heavenly realm, as far away from earthly terrestrial concerns as you can be, you look down at this tiny little globe, which they understood was a globe, and you laugh at all of the wars and the debates and the nonsense and the concerns that you have on this stupid little earth where everything is mortal and limited and unlike the eternal and everlasting that's defining it all, even incidentally according to some of them, but defining it all and making it all be and ordering it. And the reason why your spatial temporal existence, and this is an incredibly genius idea that will be hard to assimilate and understand in one go. The reason why everything you study in matter and astrophysics looks the opposite to that is that you're on the inside looking out. It would look it's the opposite. It's a reverse. Just like it looks concave as you go out to other layers and convex when you're going back down in, the entire physical structure of the physics, right? They understood the earth was round. They understood it was they understood a lot of this. But the reason why it looks the way it looks to us is that it's the opposite of the reality. You're the center because you're far away from the things that really matter. And if you were outside in those other realms, you wouldn't look like the center anymore. You look like an insignificant speck. We're trying to understand the way the medievals thought, and we're trying to do it by reading their literature. The exquisite touch which denies our species even the tragic dignity of being outcasts by making us merely suburban was added by Alanus. In other respects, so in other words, the medievals might look at us and say, why are you making humans the center of everything? In other respects, he reproduces Chalcidius's outlook. We watch the spectacle of the celestial dance from its outskirts. Our highest privilege is to imitate it in such measure as we can. The medieval model is, if we may use the word, anthropoperipheral. Anthropoperipheral. I love that word. What a great word. Anthropoperipheral. We are creatures of the margin. Chalcidius handed on more than the Timaeus. He quotes sometimes at moderate length from the Credo, Epinomius, Epinomis, Laws, Parmenides, Phaedo, these are dialogues by Plato, Phaedrus, Republic, Sophis, Theaetetus. He knows Aristotle, but has little of the latter reverence for him. Aristotle had passed over all save one of the species of dreams with his usual supercilious negligence, unquote. More quad more quadam suo, fastidiosa incuria. He's just not paying attention. He quotes and expands him. However, however, with more respect when arguing that matter, though not inherently evil, being the potentiality of all particular bodies is doomed to, though logically distinct from, the privation of forms. That is why matter craves her perfecting or embellishment, as the female desires the male. The influence of Chalcidius produces its richest results in the 12th century Latin poets associated with the school of, of Chartres, who, in their turn, helped to inspire Jean de Meung and Chaucer, the Lady Natura from Statius and Claudian, and the cosmogony of, of Chalcidius might be said to be the parents of Ber- Bernardus Sylvester's De Mundi Universitate. Its feminine noise, so oddly introduced, where we should expect the second person of the Christian Trinity, shows her lineage unmistakably, and perhaps owes her gender not so much to any Jungian archetype as to the gender of providentia in Latin, providence. In Chalcidius, too, we find the probable explanation of the mysterious garden called Granusion, which Bernard's Urania and Natura enter on descending to earth. Chalcidius had distinguished not only aether from air, but also upper air from lower air, and lower, which men can breathe, being a moist substance, umecta substantia, which the Greeks called hygrum ousion. Bernard knew no Greek, and the to him meaningless hygranusium perhaps had a bad text in a bad text has become the proper name granusian. In Bernard's successor, Alanus ab Insulis, we find an equally close linkage. In his Anti-Claudian, we are told that the soul is fastened to the body, "Gumphis subtilibus," with tiny little nails. We may smile at the almost metaphysical quaintness of the image, which, if deliberate, would be quite characteristic of Alanus. In reality, he is exactly following Chalcidius, who is exactly following Plato, and may not even know very clearly what a gumphus is. Such trifles deserve mention only as illustrations of the close discipleship that Chalcidius won from the poets of Chartres. The importance of that discipleship lies in the vigor, the gusto, the sprightliness of their response to the part and the part it played in recommending certain images and attitudes to the vernacular authors. Did I not tell you at the beginning of the last video that we were about to get into one heck of a book? And he's going to be effortlessly quoting all this stuff that none of us have freaking read because we need to read it all. And probably we'll supplement this video with readings of all these things. And then we'll actually be almost literate by the time we're done. And won't that be great? Maybe I'll even learn how to pronounce things a little bit better. Macrobius lived at the end of the fourth and the beginning. All right, so now on to section B, Macrobius. Man, there's some impressive insights in here. All right, well, this is now 2 hours. Let's stop here on the Microbius section. We've done Chalcidius. So we're going to stop here and we'll probably stream again in about half an hour.